Welcome to Achieving the SDGs. If you were to take stock of how the world is doing in terms of the SDGs, you would perhaps begin by consulting some of the national reports, some of the international reports on SDGs, on achievement and challenges related to the goals. You may get, perhaps, if you read these reports, a mixed picture. There has been success, but there are numerous challenges, and basically there is an urgent need to do even more. Let me highlight 5 sets of issues, which for me at least sums up some of the achievements and challenges that we've seen in the last 5 years. With 10 years to go, I think the first set of issues deserves even more attention, and that has to do with awareness on the SDGs. Unfortunately, it takes time. It takes a long time before a new global agenda becomes well known. For many years, the SDGs were considered to be the United Nations' best guarded secret. Nobody outside, well, very few people outside the development circles, beyond development aid, beyond UN circles, really were talking about the SDGs. That has changed. There is definitely much more awareness, not just in affluent countries. I would say that awareness sometimes, at least in initial years, was considerable in countries like Colombia, in countries like China, even in some parts of Africa. Growing increasingly, the SDGs are also now increasingly viewed as part also of the affluent country policies. So for example, in Norway, it took a long time before, and I wouldn't say a lot of people still know about the SDGs, but it took a long time before people realized that the SDGs were not just for low-income countries, were not just related to foreign aid, but they actually also applied to our lives, our forms of consumption and living standards. There's definitely much more focus in Norwegian schools, for example. My children learn much more about the SDGs now than they did before. Similarly, you have political leaders now going around with the SDG pins. It is April 2020. Because of the COVID crisis, of course, most of these ministers are seen quite often on TV, and I'm talking about the Norwegian politicians. So there is this kind of growing awareness that political leaders are trying to make their citizens aware of what the sustainable goals mean, development goals mean, not just for poor countries, but also for rich countries. But this does not mean that everybody knows, and I think we really need to put in much more effort in terms of making the SDGs not just known, but cultivating a sense of ownership that this really applies to all of us. And this goes back to perhaps reflecting more on sustainable development, reflecting more on the trade-offs of how well-being, our well-being, is built on certain policies that are not necessarily the best for the future. So it could be in relation to flying, it could be in relation to oil production, it could be in relation to consumption of textiles. So you could name a set of issues that people in affluent societies have to also address. Similarly, we have to cultivate much more awareness of the SDGs in low-income settings, where we have to talk about alternatives, not just impose restrictions, but to talk about probable, viable alternatives that people living in poverty can also implement. A second set of issues relates to the institutional setup. In the initial years, governments were extremely slow. They were dragging their feet. Some governments were quick to introduce special or so-called chief secretaries within the Prime Minister's Secretariat or the President's body of advisors. Finland was particularly exemplary in this field early on. Bangladesh was exemplary early on. Rwanda did extremely important things early on. So now there is much more attention to the fact that in order to get the different arms of government, the different ministries to actually work in tandem, to collaborate, there really needs to be an institutional setup at the highest level to coordinate implementation of the SDGs. This is not a question of just getting data every year and submitting it to the UN, but to actually implement a whole of government approach to better understand the trade-offs, the synergies between the goals, and thereby also achieve one of the most important goals for the SDGs, which is policy integration of the goals, that all of these have to be seen in relation to each other. A third set of issues relates to the non-availability of reliable and high-quality data. We have certain indicators that can be measured, and there are many indicators that cannot be measured. There's data that is produced regularly, may not be of good quality. In addition, there's the challenge that data is just not simply produced regularly enough. Here, several scholars have highlighted the challenge that many developing country, low-income country statistical offices face. They're underfunded. There's just not enough personnel, there's just not enough technology, not enough resources to carry out regular surveys and collect census data. So there definitely there has to be much more attention given to funding and building capacity of statistical bodies, but there has to be also attention to the fact that some governments tend to exaggerate or manipulate data in order to show that they've achieved success when they haven't. So in terms of data, there are several sets of challenges. Another important challenge relates to development finance. There is, or has been for several years, this tendency in many parts of the affluent world to warn that their foreign aid programs would be severely cut, because some of these countries in the West are also facing economic hardship, and that they would be thinking more about their own countries, and there's definitely been much more of an emphasis on the national interest. So aid is not necessarily the way out in terms of development finance. There is definitely much more talk about the role of the private sector, and I've never seen the private sector embrace the development agenda more warmly than they have with the SDGs. But nonetheless, the evidence so far isn't very encouraging. There has been some progress. There's definitely more climate finance. There's definitely much more interest in some parts of the private sector to align with specific SDGs or a set of SDGs, but there's been, I would say, much more talk. The rhetoric has been impressive. The reality has been less impressive. There's just not been enough focus on operationalizing these commitments. So I think we need to move beyond these conferences which proclaim the importance of the private sector embracing the SDGs to actually showing what the private sector has achieved. And not all private sector actors have shown interest in, for example, poverty reduction or hunger or health. You have some actors in India, like the Tata Group, that has embraced these developmental SDGs, whereas in many countries, in affluent countries, there's more of a tendency to focus on the climate-related goals. I'm not saying that these are unimportant. All I'm saying is that we need the private sector to not just cherry pick on certain SDGs, but to actually see how their activities within certain sectors can be viewed in relation to promoting also other goals, and not just focus on this one or two goals that their business activities focus on. So development finance in relation to foreign aid and the private sector is definitely something that we need to focus renewed attention on. But a final aspect in terms of development finance that there is much more emphasis on in recent years, and that has been in terms of budgetary allocations, domestic revenue generation. And there's been impressive progress in some parts of the world, in India, for example, at the state government level. Each state government is trying to earmark resources, allocating resources for achievement of specific SDGs. You see this also in other parts of the world. So this kind of mainstreaming of budgetary processes with the SDG policymaking process, I think, is going to be crucial. The extent to which some countries can mobilize revenue is going to be crucial. But of course, many low-income countries face other challenges. The tax base is very low. a lot of people in the informal sector that the government does not know about, they can't tax these people. This also applies to major economies in Africa like Kenya, but the informal sector is also a big sector in countries like India. So the extent to which there is domestic revenue mobilization, the extent to which the government can supplement external sources, loans, private sector contributions with its own revenue sources to finance the SDGs is going to be crucial. The final set of issues that I wish to raise in terms of this taking stock of the SDGs is political enthusiasm. Some countries went back home after September 2015, after having signed the 2030 Agenda and the 17 SDGs, and showed considerable enthusiasm. But I felt that there were some countries, yes, India and China were definitely showing some enthusiasm, but in general, most parts of the world, it just took a long time for politicians to really talk about the SDGs. And there are many explanations for this. There are competing agendas. The SDGs are just a very small part of what foreign policy is for most countries. There's the national interest, there's trade, there's environment. There are all of these parallel processes. And the 2030 Agenda, it wasn't really high on the radar of policymakers in initial years. Now, given the recent spate of crises, given much more attention on climate change, given more attention on health, given more attention on increasing hunger, given more attention on the fact that we really, because of mass quarantines during this coronavirus crisis, that we have now some experience. There are certain things that we can do to change our lifestyles. I think there is much more growing awareness, and perhaps there will be growing political enthusiasm. But I really feel that the SDGs are not going to be achieved unless there is political enthusiasm, which has sadly been lacking. I think we need greater attention to better understanding the politics of sustainable development. What are the factors that actually encourage political decision making on sustainable development, and what are the factors that constrain political decision making, or at least showing interest and enthusiasm for sustainable development. I think it'll be incorrect of us to assume that just politicians talking about the SDGs is enough. They actually have to show that they are doing something in reality, and this kind of enthusiasm is being operationalized on the ground.